Hello, my name is Mike McMillan, and I'm going to be your instructor for this course on Introductory Ruby Programming. In this short first video, I just want to give you a list of the different topics we're going to be covering in the course. So let's go ahead and start listing them out now. The first thing we're going to talk about is how to install Ruby and run simple programs. We'll also be talking about how to run Ruby interactively, although we won't use that in many of the lessons. I'll be discussing how to install Ruby for both a Windows machine and for a Mac machine. Next, we'll go right into the guts of programming and talk about working with data and variables, which is the very beginning thing that any programmer needs to know. We'll follow that with a discussion of operators and expressions, focusing primarily on arithmetic expressions just to get you comfortable with the language, but we'll look at string expressions also. Next, we'll talk about making decisions in Ruby, and that mostly covers the if statement, although we will look at a case statement also. After making decisions, we'll talk about repetition. Repetition just means looping, and we're going to look at several different ways to write loops so that we can execute statements over and over again using Ruby. Next, we'll talk about creating and using methods, and a method is just another name for a function. They're called methods in the object-oriented programming world, so Ruby uses that phraseology. But for those of you who come from another programming background, we'll just be talking about functions is really what they are. After functions, then we'll move right into object-oriented programming, and we'll cover the basics of designing classes, and we'll also look a little bit at how to do inheritance in Ruby, although that will not be the focus of our object-oriented programming material. Creating classes as a way of defining data types or user-defined data types is more the focus rather than inheritance. After that, we'll talk about how to create and use modules. Modules are just libraries of code that you can package together and then bring it into other programs. That way you can create a library for a certain function or set of functions, really, and then be able to use that library in any program or any Ruby program that you want to use it in. Next, we'll talk about reading and writing files and doing very simple network programming, nothing fancy. We won't be creating any chat servers or anything like that, but just the basics of those kinds of input and output. Next, we'll talk about using the Ruby debugger for debugging programs. And then finally, we'll talk about creating GUI programs using RubyTK. So those are the topics that we're going to be covering in the course. This course will give you an excellent background in programming in Ruby and will enable you then to move on to more sophisticated applications such as the web application framework Ruby on Rails, which is what I'm sure many of you are interested in as a goal in learning Ruby. But even if you're not going to do that, Ruby is an interesting language on its own. It's very easy to learn and use. It has a minimal amount of syntax. And I believe, especially if you already know a programming language, that you'll find Ruby very easy to pick up and start using right away. And with that, I'm going to wrap up this introduction, and let's move right on in to the first lesson on how to install Ruby.